So, a little bit of background on John Milton and Paradise Lost, because we are not, I know that you are thankful that we are not reading the whole thing. I mean, people dedicate full semesters to reading Paradise Lost. So, we are only reading book nine in this class. So, John Milton was a prolific writer prior to the Commonwealth, and the ban on before the he was a prolific writer prior to the Commonwealth and the ban on literary works during the Commonwealth. And in his 20s, he had this ambition of being the next great epic writer. He wanted to write the great English epic. Edmund Spenser, he was the 16th century or 16th, 15th century author of no 16th century author of the great national epic, The Faerie Queene, which is a political allegory idealizing Queen Elizabeth. However, it is not until he is in his 50s that he actually writes it. So John Milton was indeed a Puritan, and he was a fervent supporter of Cromwell and the Puritan Reformation. And he devoted 19 years of his life to politics. And the beginning of the English Civil War, where we have this small number of Puritan small number of Puritan kind of dissenters with this exuberant enthusiasm, effectively take control of the state. And Milton participated in this radical movement to execute the tyrant King Charles I, and to establish Parliament's desire to establish its own government. Milton was a key figure in this new non-monarchic government, initially a commonwealth and then a republic. He is the foremost propagandist for the Puritan side and wrote extensively in favor of the execution of King Charles and genocide in general in his pamphlet Iconoclastes, which is this defense of the principle of genocide. Around this time in 1651, he loses his eyesight, so he writes most of Paradise Lost blind. He's no longer able to pick up a pen. He also wrote pamphlets against the Church of England and on divorce. Just a FYI on a side, his wife, who was a royalist supporter at the time of the Civil War, ended up divorcing him, which kind of ruined his credibility in the church for a while. He wrote on, ironically, also the defense of the press and liberty, which ended in during the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. But anyways, he is a big figure and works with Oliver Cromwell as he serves as the state licensor of printed text and the nation's Latin secretary, where basically he composed and translated all of England's correspondence with governments on the continent. He devoted contributions of his devotion to the Puritan government, and it's really at the height of his political idealism. Fast forward a few years, by the end of the 1650s, Milton could see clearly, no pun intended, because he's blind, the imminent collapse of the Republican government. A majority of Englishmen were calling for the return of the nation's rightful monarch, and it wasn't long before the revolution failed and the Stuart monarchy was restored. Charles II, when he is returned to the throne, Many of the Puritan revolutionaries experienced a humiliating defeat, and Milton was one of them. He saw a lot of his friends arrested for treason. They were hanged and quartered. And I mean, think about back in our first unit when we talked about the first English Civil War, the War of the Roses, and Thomas Mallory is on the losing side of that altercation. What happened to him? He went to jail. Well, Milton, after the restoration of the monarchy, was also imprisoned and stripped of a lot of his lands. And it was, I mean, he had to go into hiding essentially. And it was only because of some influential friends, Andrew Marvell, to name one, the author of To His Coy Mistress from last week, that he wasn't jailed indefinitely and or killed. So I mean, because it is entirely imaginable that Milton could have been executed for his regicide writings. Once the revolution fails, he decides to write Paradise Lost. And he decides not to write an epic on nationalist themes. In his eyes, there is no nation worth writing about. All of his labors in the cause of liberating England from the the tyranny of monarchy, he sees has been futile or useless. His glorious expectations of England's transformation, this kind of Puritan paradise, have been destroyed, and it's at this point he chooses to write about the fall of Adam and Eve and the fall of the rebel angels. And there really is this troubling analogy throughout Paradise Lost that associates the paradise that man lost with the utopian Puritan government that England lost. But there's also an even more troubling analogy or parallel when his kind of use of Satan, which we will talk about. And I think that the interesting question is, why does Milton invite the association of the failure of the just revolution, the just cause of the Puritans, to the unjust revolution of the rebel angels under the guidance of Satan? So that's an interesting question. And I want to talk really quickly. Now that we've talked about John Milton, I do want to talk about the actual text, Paradise Lost. It is considered one of the greatest literary masterpieces in the English language. Joseph Addison, who we'll talk about next unit, said that he marveled at Milton's real brilliancy and descriptive language. And then on the other hand, people like Samuel Johnson, who will also read, says that he couldn't have finished this poem fast enough. But the premise of Paradise Lost is this retelling of Genesis, where he really complicates accepted truths by having Satan as this sympathetic hero, of Adam as this sympathetic hero, and this kind of imposing authority of God. And the reason he does this is because he wants to focus. I mean, think about it. He was this really radical political idealist, and he, all of his ideals, his idealism, have been lost through the Restoration. They've been lost because of Cromwell's perversion of the political ideals he held true to. So he wants to focus on this kind of idea of Genesis and the fall of man. It's a fitting subject in a lot of ways because Milton sees himself as fallen, as someone who has been deceived, as someone who has been manipulated by someone who had powers greater, or who didn't have as pure of intentions as he did. he, I mean, and typically the fall is associated as something as a failure, but Milton kind of reinvents this idea of the fall because he sees himself as fallen. He's not this prominent figure in society, but is instead an outcast. And this epic, this kind of literary masterpiece that he pens, is his chance, or he saw it as his chance to kind of rise again and reinvent himself. So he writes this epic poem, and remember, poems are these long narratives that focus on the hero's journey, and in some ways the epic poem is really outdated by the time he writes this novel. I mean, it's not novel, but this epic. It was 80 years ago that the last of the great epics was written, and even then it was losing favor. So in a lot of ways, this poem, or this epic, is a way of him reinventing himself, but also he's really reinventing the kind of poem, the epic poem, in a way, both thematically and structurally. In a lot of ways, this Milton's epic, it does highlight some of the main characteristics of an epic poem. It deals with it has this hero of great importance, albeit it's somewhat strange to think of Adam and Satan as being these heroes. It has these great battles. There's a stated argument. It begins in the middle of things. There's this invocation of the muse or the Holy Spirit. But it's different because it reinvents this. It's not written in iambic pentameter, and I'm not going to go into all of the ins and outs of the form, but it's written in blank verse, and that's what makes it so intriguing. So he's focused on the form and reinventing it, but he's also looking at the purpose, his theme, or his purpose for the epic. And in this epic is his chance to look at something from a biblical standpoint, and biblical imagery. It's not this typical hero that is the focus of other epics, but his purpose is to justify the ways of God to man. He wants to explain the reasons that men suffer because he himself is suffering. And he also wants an attempt to reconcile his idyllic beliefs or his idealistic beliefs with the reality of the destruction that Cromwell and his supporters brought England. And ultimately his main idea is to kind of show that the fall of man is actually fortunate because it provides the ability to progress. It provides the ability to rise. It offers this kind of concept of redemption. And keep in mind that part of this poem is political allegory. One part of the narrative focuses on Lucifer, and this is not the part of the poem that we are going to focus on, but it's important to understand what he does through Satan to aid our understanding of where we are in Book 9. So in epics, heroes are traditionally figures of great stature, and Milton complicates that in Paradise Lost through his sympathetic treatment of Satan, this figure who is traditionally represented as the embodiment of evil. But in Paradise Lost, Satan is not inherently evil. He is someone who has a genuine dissatisfaction with submitting to ultimate authority, the ultimate authority of God. His central beliefs is that angels should be free to determine their own destinies. And that is a parallel to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, this idea of free choice, this idea of freedom to do the right thing. But this kind of the angels and Lucifer before he becomes Satan, this to determine their own destinies is also a parallel to the conflict between Charles I and Parliament, a denunciation of the divine right of kings that the monarchy used as a justification for autocratic rule. So Satan becomes, in some ways, this Oliver Cromwell figure that represents freedom in its highest form. In its highest form and its highest good, it's worth sacrificing everything else. Milton, in some ways, compels us to feel sympathy for Satan through his psychological complexities, as we'll see when we get to the Garden of Eden. And as he becomes progressively more evil, his progressively tyrannical rule in hell, where he remains free, he's still dissatisfied with what he has, so he must travel the earth to corrupt Adam and Eve. And this could be seen as a critique of the Commonwealth's governance and how it turned out in practice. While initially motivated by pure and reasonable complaints and lofty goals, Cromwell's government, the one that Milton believed so fervently in, was ended up being cruel and petty, a cruel and petty dictatorship, losing sight of its principles that guided them to revolt against the monarchy to begin with. And like Satan and his army of rebellious angels, Cromwell's regime sought to kill and oppress just because they could. And Satan, like Cromwell, is a renegade who broke with centuries of tradition for admirable reasons, but loses sight of his principles and allows himself to be overcome with pride and greed. And that has damaging effects on the English people and in turn Adam and Eve. So in some ways, like I said, Satan is this Oliver Cromwell figure, which we'll kind of talk about. But I want to talk about Adam as this both a figure for John Milton and also a stand-in for the English people and their ability to be pawns at the hands of powers that were higher than theirs. So there is this political allegory. I do want to talk really quickly about the structure of the poem to give you some kind of context, because like I said, we are not reading all of the poem, but it can be broken up into three parts. Part one, it's the invocation, the woes of man, the rebellion of the angels in heaven, this kind of first disobedience where Satan's and the other demons journey to hell. And then there in book 3, God and Jesus have this conversation about the need for redemption. And then in book 4, Adam and Eve are introduced, and this kind of divine order of patriarchy is established where God is greater than man, and man is greater than woman, which is kind of interesting. In part 2, books 5 and 6 have flashbacks between the war in heaven, and that's told to Adam and Eve. In book 7, ironically, 7 Days of Creation is the hymn of creation. It's how the earth was made. And then in book 8, prior to our reading for this week, we have a warning from Raphael, the angel, about too much knowledge. Eve leaves to tend her flowers, but she overhears some of the conversation with Adam. So man is given free will, but man is also given the knowledge that that free will be tested. So then we get into part 3, and we begin in book 9. And book 9 is really, why does it take so long to get to the fall of man? But in book 9, Lucifer has been banished from heaven. He's been sent to the Tartarus, or what becomes hell. And God has created the world. Adam and Eve have been warned. And we get this sense that book 9 is the ultimate climax. It is the real tragedy of the tale, and its focus is on disloyalty and disobedience. Some themes to look for in book 9 is this kind of free will and free will in action, the analyzing of moral decisions, because these characters go back and forth about should I do it, should I not do it, the nature of temptation and testing, love and power relations of male and female, the difficulty in distinguishing true and false statements, persuasion and manipulation, deception and self-deception, pre-fall innocence and post-fall experience, this idea of dominance, and love, and yes, sex. So I am going to pick up here with book 9, and hopefully it won't take too terribly long. So stay tuned.